Write it on your heart that today is the best day of the year. I wish I had written that, and I didn't. But you know who wrote it? Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's a great essayist, a lecturer, a poet. Born a couple hundred years ago. Anybody know Henry David Thoreau? They were contemporaries. Thoreau came about around 15 years after Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were artists. They were artists in the way we think of the arts, certainly in the way I think of the arts. The arts can be music, it is dance, it's literature, and it's art that we can stand in front of and adore and understand and be with. And something I love about the arts is that we can be with it and experience it in very short time frames, or we can go really, really deep. And I used to kind of, when the internet's coming along, I'm thinking, oh, this is just going to really destroy this experience of being with art. And I have completely changed my mind about that. I want to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you several stories today, if you'll hang with me long enough. We're going to shift a little bit here. I'm going to tell you some stories about my early experiences and my ongoing experiences with the arts. And I will tell you, I want to lead this by saying and sharing that in my view, the arts are both window and mirror. When I was a very little girl, and I'm saying little, I bet I was 4 or 5 years old, one of the first objects I ever looked at and held in my hands that I considered like art, I don't know that I knew the word yet, but I felt something, was a little walnut head doll. Has anybody ever seen a walnut head doll? It was made by my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and it had hair from her head woven in it, and it had a little outfit on, actually I would learn later, made of the cloth from a World War I soldier's uniform. And there were other dolls in this set. And in this set, there was a little African-American doll. And I was 4 or 5 years old. And I was really, I don't even know that I knew to ask questions about this, but when you grew up in my family, you were going to get the stories. And the arts and art and music and dance and literature are all filled with stories. I led with a quote by Emerson. Do you know some politicians, some of our greatest leaders in this country adored the work that he wrote? He was about individualism. And he was a scholar. He studied nature, but he studied nature in man. Thoreau studied nature in kind of a little bit of a different way, but both of them believed in individualism. Can you imagine one of the leaders in our country who was very into his writings? Martin Luther King. John F. Kennedy. People who would follow him and learn his works and get this piece about individualism. So as I go back to this little doll, I will tell you as a very young girl in the early 60s, my great-grandmother was already planting the seeds that would be very important for me to understand later on in terms of the civil rights movement, for example. She told me stories like I could see these little dolls, and what were they? They were soldiers and nurses and mail carriers. And she would tell me stories about these. And I still have some of those dolls. I think all the walnut heads are gone, but I do have some with her hair woven, which is just fantastical to me. Absolutely fantastical. So through my great-grandmother, I learned some things about culture. And we learned them in a way that was so easy for me to get and so very exciting for me to get. Does that make sense? It wasn't about, I didn't have to go out and I didn't have to open an encyclopedia. I was really getting this first-hand experience about culture and what had happened before me. I learned about the Great Depression. I learned about world wars. I learned why my great-grandfather was no longer around. She told me stories about my grandfather, who was an Army officer. And there were all of these stories passed along. If any of you have ever visited my home, and a few of you have, you will know that when someone points to something and asks, what is my favorite question? Tell me the story in that. I grew up with a father who was my greatest fan. Someone over here shared about their dad earlier. You may have moved in the room. I get that. He was a military officer, and we traveled the globe. My mother was a very traditional mom. You know, she kept 4 of us kids flying all over the planet, usually traveling alone. You know, my dad would have gone out in front of us, and my mom was the very, very traditional military wife. And we always had beautiful things in our home. And my mom would never put them away. It didn't matter how little we were. She wanted us to have the stories, and she wanted us to be able to touch things. My father would travel to Korea, and he would come back with gorgeous silk fabrics. And when he brought these fabrics back, of course, I was like, oh, Daddy, can I touch them? May I touch them? Well, I could only touch them after I heard the stories, right? You know, because that's sort of how that went. And so he would tell me stories, and I would begin to understand, oh, the Silk Road, the whole silk industry, it didn't start in Korea. It actually started in China. Many of us know that. How many of y'all know about the Silk Road, the 4,000-mile Silk Road that spans across China? Thank you, David, for knowing that. There are the guy in our room, ladies, okay, come on. There are tremendous stories in that. And I would get these stories, and then he would share with me, well, you know, honey, the reason that it came to Korea is that several immigrants from China brought it over, and so it became a significant industry that fed families. Do you understand? It fed families. We're talking about things that happen in our world that have connections. My mom, when we lived in Japan, she collected what are called kokeshi dolls. And they're little wooden dolls. And when my mother died, I got the whole collection. And it hangs by my back door, and it's absolutely... Do you have some kokeshi dolls? They're absolutely fabulous. Bring your dolls. We'll have a doll day. It'll be totally fun. So you may know that the way that those dolls began is really out of craftspeople who would make utensils for the home. So they would make things like spoons and ladles and objects that you could use in industry in the home. And then they were these wonderful folk craft artists who were creating in this region. There was also a spring spa, something really yummy that the rich could come to in this particular town. So during off seasons, during the holidays, they began to carve dolls to make money for their families, additional families. Well, these families who came in and were tourists could afford to buy the dolls, and so the dolls turned into an industry. It was really kind of magical. We lived in Germany. We lived in Japan. We lived all over the United States. My dad was an officer, and we were able to really... We were able to take a ship overseas, and it was the last year that they ever did that. It was just an incredible, incredible experience to be able to do that as a family. But I saw so many things that to this day still inform how I think about things. And what I love about the internet, and I mentioned that earlier, is that now I can have something in my hand. I can look at something, and I can go as deep as I want into discovery about whatever that is. So I suspect that the arts can actually be a magical window into us learning about cultures, our own, other cultures, and the connectivity between all of that. So then, beautiful story. You know, my mother, when we lived in Japan, she took ikebana classes, and she learned how the Japanese art of flower arranging. As a designer today, those theories that they use in the art of flower arranging in Japan are everywhere in what I do. There is simplicity, there is line, there is less is more, there isn't a bunching together of a bunch of flowers. Everything in those arrangements has a story. It is magical. So can you live a life, and can you build a city, and can you build communities and not have the arts? I'm not really sure that we can build a community in which people thrive, really, really thrive. Cities are built with industry, they're built with science, and I believe they're built with the arts. And it is a place, there's nothing highbrow here, people. This is an opportunity for us to get down and dirty. And here's where we're going to shift here. Down and dirty with art that you may not even want to see. Some years back, some of you all know that I've had many exchange students, and a couple of my girls were from Brazil. And some of my spunkiest, funnest, I'm telling you, those people know how to party. You know, I think my last trip there, 5 days there, and I slept 11 hours. Seriously, people. You know, they do not let you sleep. I was so interested to see the amount of graffiti that there is in Brazil. And, I mean, it's everywhere, really. It's everywhere. Some of you all understand the disparity between the masses in Brazil, and they've been working to remedy this. But at the time that I visited, it was really, really abject poverty, and then a tiny bit of the wealth, you know, within gated communities. So by the time I went to Brazil, remember I had all of this background in the arts, and so I began to study, really, and ask questions about all of this graffiti. Now, personally, I found so much of it beautiful. And at the same time, I saw buildings, and I was thinking, I bet they kind of don't want that, you know, all over their buildings. Well, when you understand that graffiti generates from people who feel they have no voice, it's a challenge. It's an opportunity for all of us, all right? So I began to study this. I began to look at this. Do you know that in Brazil, if you are a wealthy businessman or wealthy businesswoman and you are building a building, do you know this is a very good chance that you're going to hire a graffiti artist to graffiti your building before it gets marked? Can you imagine that? Some spectacular art, really spectacular art. The building that I'm in kind of a neighborhood here in Lubbock. We have a real wonderful little unique neighborhood. We have a little shopping plaza, and I bought this old building of my dreams. Has this wonderful history to it. Has a great story, right? You know, got the backstory. And my building was marked several times. Unfortunately, the markings on it were twice a word that I really didn't want on my building. Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm like, okay, paint over it, or I'm going to commit, I'm going to get it painted again. The third time that it was marked, they just drew a nice straight line, and then they ran a little letter or symbol at the bottom. So I drove up one day, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I've been tagged. And I just stood there in front of that. And first of all, I said, thanks, to myself, to the artist, thanks a lot for not writing a word, that I'm going to need to feel like I need to paint over. I left that tagging there, and my building has never been tagged since then. And I stood in front of that piece of art, and really, honestly, it is a line with a symbol. And I hold it as a piece of art, as someone's expression. Some of you all know that I have graffiti now on my garage doors, and we have at Luca a whole bunch of great graffiti. And it is out of that, it is artistic graffiti, and it is an expression. So as I'm standing there looking at some of that, it reminded me, or I'm remembering today because I want to share a different story. Recently, I was at a gallery showing, and I'm standing there in front of art, amazing art, all around the room. This is an artist whose work I actually am privileged to have in my home. And I can remember a time when he created work that was so disturbing to me in subject matter that I just thought that I could not have it in my home. And so I was really grateful some years later when he created art, and I went, oh, there's a piece I can have in my home. Okay, that makes me happy. I can be with that. All right, so Some years ahead, I'm standing, I'm looking at all of this art, and I'm seeing now, I'm wanting to buy a piece of art, I'm like, oh, I'd love to come home with a new piece, and I'm looking at a lot of this art, and I'm thinking, oh, again, I just really don't want to be with this art. So I stood there in front of that art for a little bit, and I thought, why am I resisting this art? And it reminded me, when I saw this quote? I was out on Saturday with my dogs at Texas Tech University, which, by the way, has an incredible collection of art, public art. And I'm there with the horse sculpture, the driftwood, that beautiful piece. And there's a quote, one of Carl Jung's quotes, that says, that which irritates us the most in others has the opportunity to tell us the most about ourselves. And so when we're thinking about developing community, if you think it is not important that we learn not only to stand and be with something or someone we resist, it is important to step past that and tolerate. And then I really want to submit that it's important to step forward and attempt in every fiber of your being to understand. Because the arts has every piece of the puzzle to expose us to stories that we really ought to be hearing. It's so fun. The first time you buy yourself a piece of art and you're standing there with it and you're just like, oh, I'm just so happy I have a piece of original art. This is great. And original art comes in all shapes, sizes, and price ranges, right? So it's accessible. And remember, art is dance. I know a lot of y'all dance all the time. Art is reading a book and referencing back to something. And I think what we could use in our community is a little bit more understanding. And if we will exercise that muscle, the muscle that happens when we stand in front of a painting or we pick up a book and we just go, or we read something or we look at the graffiti and we're just disgusted. And we say, I just hate it when people do that. I wish you wouldn't write about that. I don't want to look at that. That sometimes those very things that we kind of don't want to look at are really the things that we could be looking at and that we maybe ought to be looking at. Because some of those are glimpses of our culture and the cultures that came before those that we even get to share this particular planet with. And they're significant stories. I will tell you one quick story. Last Friday, I'm on my way back from Midland. That's right, glamorous. That's where I do some of my business. I'm grateful. Driving back, it's Friday night. I've been out a lot during the week. And you know how on Friday night you're kind of like, oh, God, just really like, maybe just love to go home and do nothing. And I get a call from a friend who attends my house concerts, and he said, there's something kind of extraordinary going on tonight at a coffee shop. You might want to come by. So I'm just like, I'm by myself. I'll be there 10 minutes after you start. Is that cool? He says, yes. And some of you all may know that we have a place, a coffee shop in Lubbock, where they, every Friday night, there is a collective of people who love traditional Irish song and dance. That's right, people, it happens right here. And they also do bluegrass on a night, and they do jazz on a night, so it's really compelling. That night, they sang, they danced, and they shared stories. I mentioned Emerson at the front of this little chat. He also influenced William Butler Yeats, who came out of Ireland, and some of the densest group of people starved for education. Do you know that in Ireland it is a requirement that every young school child, like from the age of 4, they are in theater, they are introduced to theater, they're in front of rooms like this. They learn it. I walked into that room. First of all, I knew like 2 people in the room. The sense of community was immediate. The sense of fellowship was immediate. And this very, very young man, probably his early 20s, stood and with reverence recited William Butler Yeats in a room on a Friday night in Lubbock, Texas. And I'm going to tell you, No one spoke. It was incredible. A singer began to sing. It was done. Get out, enjoy, tolerate, stand in front of, and thank you for your time today.